Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to Crossroads Online. We are here this morning, got a little bit of a different format, but we're going to keep going, and we are looking at the journey from Easter to Pentecost, the time between Easter and Pentecost, what happened during that time. So the disciples are beginning to move from doubt to belief and from fear to faith. Jesus has imparted salvation and the Spirit to the disciples. Now, Jesus moves on to someone who's going to be essential in the early church, Peter. And we pick it up in John chapter 21 at verse 1. Afterward, Jesus appeared again to his disciples by the Sea of Galilee. It happened this way. Simon Peter, Thomas, also known as Didymus, Nathanael from Cana in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, and two other disciples were together. "I'm going out to fish," Simon Peter told them, and they said, "We'll go with you." So they went out and got into the boat, but that night they caught nothing. Early in the morning, Jesus stood on the shore, but the disciples did not realize that it was Jesus. He called out to them, "Friends, haven't you any fish?" "No," they answered. He said, "Throw your net on the right side of the boat, and you will find some." When they did, they were unable to haul the net in because of the large number of fish. Then the disciple whom Jesus loved said to Peter, "It is the Lord." As soon as Simon Peter heard him say, "It is the Lord," he wrapped his outer garment around him, for he had taken it off, and jumped into the water. The other disciple followed in the boat, towing the net full of fish, for they were not far from shore, about 100 yards. When they landed, they saw a fire of burning coals there with fish on it and some bread. Jesus said to them, "Bring some of the fish you've just caught." So Simon Peter climbed back into the boat and dragged the net ashore. It was full of large fish, 153. But even with so many, the net was not torn. Jesus said to them, "Come and have breakfast." None of the disciples dared ask him, "Who are you?" They knew it was the Lord. Jesus came, took the bread, and gave it to them, and did the same with the fish. This was now the third time Jesus appeared to his disciples after he was raised from the dead. Now remember, just to set the scene here, this is Peter we're talking about, and Peter has just spectacularly failed Jesus. He's denied him 3 times just a little while before this episode. Now, this is the same Peter who Jesus said would be the rock of the early church. So let's back up for a second to Matthew 16, 17 to 19. And this is what Jesus said about Peter just a little while before this. Jesus replied, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for this was not revealed to you by flesh and blood, but my Father in heaven. And I tell you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overcome it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven." So now, knowing about Peter's failure, his denial of Jesus, how can Jesus now build his church on Peter, who's failed so significantly? Fortunately for us, Jesus is in the restoration business, and Peter may be down, but he's not out. So unsurprisingly, in this episode in John, we find Peter, the fisherman, on the water, fishing. Jesus happens to be sitting nearby on the shore. Not happens to be, he's there intentionally, but the disciples don't know it. And he calls out to the disciples and asks them how the fishing's been going. Not good. They've been out all night and haven't caught anything. Now, Jesus tells them to cast their nets on the right side of the boat, and they'll catch some fish. Now, professional fishermen, as Peter and some of the other disciples were, know that if they've been out all night fishing and they haven't caught anything, tossing their nets a few feet on the other side of the boat is not going to make any difference. They haven't caught anything all night. They're not going to catch anything now. But they do what Jesus says. They toss the nets on the right side, and they haul in a huge load of fish. And we even have the detail. There was 153 fish. That's a lot of fish after a bad night of fishing. And in this moment, the disciples recognize Jesus. They realize it's him. So why do they recognize him at this moment? Well, a miracle very similar to this has happened before. Going back to near the beginning of the Gospels in Luke 5, this is what had happened. One day, as Jesus was standing by the lake of Gennesaret, the people were crowding around him and listening to the word of God. He saw at the water's edge 2 boats, left there by fishermen who were washing their nets. He got into one of the boats, the one belonging to Simon, and asked him to put out a little from shore. Then he sat down and taught the people from the boat. When he had finished speaking, he said to Simon, "Put out into deep water and let down the nets for a catch." Simon answered, "Master, we've worked hard all night and haven't caught anything, but because you say so, I will let down the nets." When they'd done so, they caught such a large number of fish that their nets began to break. So they signaled their partners in the other boat to come and help them, and they came and filled both boats so full they began to sink. When Simon Peter saw this, he fell at Jesus' knees and said, "Go away from me, Lord, I'm a sinful man." For he and all his companions were astonished at the catch of fish they'd taken, and so were James and John, the sons of Zebedee, Simon's partners. Then Jesus said to Simon, "Don't be afraid. From now on you will fish for people." So they pulled their boats up on the shore, left everything, and followed him. So it's no wonder that the disciples recognized Jesus in this miracle, because something very similar had happened before. And it's not surprising that Jesus used a miracle, a fish, to catch fishermen. He spoke to them in a way that they would understand. And it was one of the first miracles he used to call the disciples to him. And now he uses a very similar miracle as he is proving himself to the disciples and as he begins the process of restoring Peter. Now the disciples land the boat here in John, and Jesus proceeds to cook them breakfast. Now can you imagine this? The Lord of the universe, Jesus, sitting there on the beach, cooking you breakfast and just waiting to hang out. You think, man, wouldn't Jesus have something better to do than cooking breakfast and having a nice, beach breakfast with the disciples? But this is the kind of Lord he is, and he wants to spend time with the disciples, and he wants to serve them and just have a conversation with them as he continues preparing them for Pentecost. Now they eat breakfast together, and Jesus gets down to business with Peter. So again, we're recognizing here that Peter has just failed Jesus. He's denied him 3 times. What is Peter thinking right now? What's going on in his mind as he considers the events of the last few days? How does he feel now talking to Jesus? Is he ashamed? Is he worried about what Jesus might say? Does he fear that the relationship has been broken? Let's see what happens. So we're picking it up again in John chapter 21. When they'd finished eating, Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" "Yes, Lord," he said, "you know that I love you." Jesus said, "Feed my lambs." Again Jesus said, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" He answered, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." Jesus said, "Take care of my sheep." The 3rd time he said to him, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" Peter was hurt because Jesus asked him the 3rd time, "Do you love me?" He said, "Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you." Jesus said, "Feed my sheep. Very truly I tell you, when you were younger, you dressed yourself and went where you wanted. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands, and someone else will dress you and lead you where you do not want to go." Jesus said this to indicate the kind of death by which Peter would glorify God. Then he said to him, "Follow me." That's John 21:15-19. 3 times Jesus asks Peter, "Do you love me?" 3 times Peter had denied Jesus. And 3 times Peter responds to Jesus that yes, he loves him. And just as Jesus showed Peter, the fisherman, as he first called him through a miraculous catch of fish, so here he uses a fishing miracle to begin the restoration of Peter. Jesus, in his wise way, speaks to Peter, the fisherman, in a way that he would understand. And you see, Jesus speaks your language. He speaks in a way that you will understand. The Lord of the universe speaks to you personally. He doesn't use an engineering miracle to catch Peter's attention. He uses a fishing miracle to catch the attention of a professional fisherman. Now, because of the similarities between the first miracle and the second miracle, and Peter's initial call and his restoration here, I would suggest that Jesus did this very intentionally. He is pointing back to Peter's original calling here as he restores him to his calling after Peter has failed. The calling has not been lost, and Jesus is going to restore Peter. Jesus stepped right back into Peter's life and called him back to the mission that he had first called him to. Now, as humans, what is our tendency when someone fails or fails us or fails to live up to expectations? We would tend to criticize their failure. We might lose trust in someone if they have failed us, especially if it's been significant. However, Jesus does not lose trust in Peter, and he doesn't abandon him. And as we see in the rest of the New Testament, Peter certainly did end up living up to his calling. He did indeed become what Jesus had seen in him all along, the rock that he would build the church on. Now, from the very first time that Jesus saw Simon, who would become Peter, he called out who he was. So right back to the beginning of the book of John 1:40 to 42, this is the first thing we hear Jesus speak about Simon, who would be Peter. Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, was one of the two who heard what John had said and who had followed Jesus. The first thing Andrew did was find his brother Simon and tell him, "We have found the Messiah, that is the Christ." And he brought him to Jesus. Jesus looked at him and said, "You are Simon, son of John. You will be called Cephas," which when translated is Peter. Now, the name Cephas, translated into Greek, Peter, means rock. So at this point, back to Peter's initial meeting with Jesus, he was still years away from the mature leader of the early church, from writing books of the Bible, from being, the key leader in the early beginnings of the church. He was still immature. He was still maybe young. He still had a lot of things to work out and a lot of growth that needed to happen. Yet Jesus already saw in him the rock that he would become. He saw Peter's character. He saw his potential. He saw what he would be, even though it wasn't yet in existence, even though it wasn't yet happening in Peter's life. He saw what he would be, not just what he was at the time. Indeed, Jesus immediately gave Simon a new name when he met him. His given name, his birth name, the name his parents gave him was Simon. But Jesus declares that he will be named Peter, meaning rock. Jesus calls out his new identity even before it is fully realized. And I think one of our primary weaknesses as humans is we tend to see people only as they are, or we see the outward appearance, or we see their actions, and we judge people based on that. And we see that certainly in the Old Testament, where the prophet Samuel was choosing the new king at God's command, and he was looking at, he looked at the big, tall, older, stronger brothers and thought that one will be the king. But God makes it clear that he looks at the heart, at the inner parts of the person, not just the outward appearance, where we humans tend to focus our attention. And it turned out to be the most unlikely person who became the next king of Israel, and that's King David. But that's another story. We tend to see people as they are. We tend to see their appearance. We tend to see them at a point in time, and we fail to see people as a work in progress. On the one hand, maybe we look at a young person, or maybe we look at a new believer, and we sometimes fail to see the potential rather than just the current struggles or immaturity. And on the other hand, maybe we see a wise, mature person, a mature leader, and we recognize that in them, but we forget about the struggles, the formation, the development, the process that brought them to that place of maturity, and the years of preparation that took to get there. Now, we can't force progress. We can't jump straight from immaturity to maturity. We simply have to take the next step and trust what Jesus is doing in our lives right now and just continue following him and taking that next right step. We have to trust that just as Jesus is working in my life, so he is working in other people's lives, and we're all a work in progress. Jesus saw through the rough exterior of Peter, Simon at this time, and he saw through to Peter. He saw the potential, and he saw the mature leader that would come later, even though it wasn't in appearance yet. So Peter's failure in denying Jesus wasn't the end of his calling. It was just another obstacle to be overcome. In fact, Jesus certainly knew that Peter was going to deny him, and yet he called him anyway. And isn't that reassuring? Even knowing that we are going to fail, Jesus still calls people anyways, and he still calls us to follow him. And how many of us do you think would invest years of our lives into mentoring someone who we knew was going to fail us at a key moment? And this is what Jesus did with Peter. And he knew that there was always hope. Even though Peter would fail, he would continue on the path. The record of Peter's reinstatement stands as an encouragement for all who might crack under pressure and deny their Lord. This is not the same as cold-blooded apostasy and is not regarded as such by the Lord. Because again, Jesus is in the restoration business, fortunately for us. And with Jesus, a failure or struggle is not the end of the journey. It's not the end of the road. Failure can be an excellent learning experience if we learn from it and return to Jesus and allow him to restore us. So on the journey to Pentecost, Jesus here made a key stop with Peter and restored him to his original calling, even though he had failed. Now, Peter's being restored and prepared for the next steps. And certainly the next time that we see Peter, we will realize that Jesus' confidence and investment in Peter has been well placed. So the time between Easter and Pentecost was a key time of preparation for the disciples. And there's a difference between the waiting of just killing time or waiting for something to happen and the waiting of active preparation. See, Jesus wasn't just waiting around to go back to heaven and killing time. He was actively preparing the disciples for the next step in their journey. He was very intentionally using this time to prepare the disciples. Peter's restoration is a key part of this phase of active preparation. So in your own life, pay attention to what Jesus is calling you to right now. You know, it's easy to think about 10, 20 years down the road, what might happen, next year, what might happen. It's good to have these dreams and to think about long-term and what's going to happen. But what is Jesus calling you to right now? Or even if you have a long-term dream or vision or goal, what is the next right step to take on that path? Instead of waiting around for something to happen to us, what is that next step of active preparation that Jesus is calling you to? What can you do today, even if it's just a small thing, to take that next step on the path that Jesus is calling you to? We recognize Jesus looks at a person's potential and their inner character, not their failures and their shortcomings. We all have shortcomings. We all have fallen short, and we've all made our own share of failures. But fortunately, that's not how Jesus views us and judges us. He views people through their character. He views us through our character and our potential and our obedience and willingness to follow him, not our failures and shortcomings. Do you maybe feel like you've failed Jesus? Failure is not the end. It's not the end of your story. Jesus, again, is in the restoration business, and he longs to meet with you. No matter whether you feel you failed a little bit or failed spectacularly, It doesn't get too much worse than what happened with Peter. He flat out denied Jesus after spending years of his life with him. But that wasn't the end. It was overcome. Peter was restored. So even if you feel like you failed Jesus, you can return. He longs to restore your relationship with him. On the other hand, maybe you feel like people have failed you and that people have let you down. And we know in this human life, failure is part of life. It happens. We all fail. We all mess up. We all make mistakes. Now, instead of judging other people and holding that against them for their failures and mistakes and shortcomings, even though they have affected you, you can choose to put that into Jesus' hands and recognize that everyone is on a journey, just as you are. And as Jesus is patient with you and longs to restore you, he is doing the same type of work in other people's lives. And we get to trust him for our journey as much as we trust him for other people's journey. But their journey is their journey. All we can control is our own journey. But maybe you feel that Jesus has failed you. He's let you down. He hasn't come through. He hasn't lived up to expectations. And this is a hard one. And I'm not going to say that there's any easy answers. But at the end of the day, Jesus longs to have a relationship with you. He longs to take you in his arms and hold you close and love you and just carry you through those difficult times. But failure and struggle is part of human life. And it's often in those struggles and those difficult situations and events that we learn the most and grow the most. Because if Jesus just instantly gave us everything we wanted, our faith would never be developed and tested. Peter had to struggle, and you could argue that he had to fail in order to become the leader that he would become later. And Jesus used these struggles in Peter's life to build his faith and for him to become the rock that would lead the early church. So today, we can choose to recognize just a couple things I want to leave with us as we wrap up this morning or whenever you're watching this. Recognize this: today's failure may be the seed of tomorrow's maturity. And I want to say that again because I think it's really important. And I think, I need to hear this, and I think someone else needs to hear this too. Today's failure may be the seed of tomorrow's maturity. And just as Jesus gave Simon a new name, Peter, he called out his new identity. Today's Simon may be tomorrow's Peter, because Jesus is in the business of restoration. We're all on this journey to Pentecost together. And this is a journey from doubt to belief, from fear to faith, from failure to maturity. So let's keep walking together.